just not an expert. I just happen to be the head teacher for both Nikolaev's, which is the name of the Russian village, and Anchor Point. And because I live in Anchor Point, I get involved in the social interaction, and sometimes it's kind of hostile and violent towards this group. My interest in history has led me to a little bit of research, and here's where I want to build up being an expert. But as I drove up here today, I thought that 1667, just about 300 years before these people landed in the Kenai Peninsula, the Russian Church had a very important meeting with all the bishops either there or represented. And these believers, ancestors, at that time, were told that they had to fall in line with the reforms that Nikon, the head of the church, wanted to instigate at that time. I think there's a couple of things that were significant. The reforms were attempt, not only on the part of the church, but on the part of Peter the Great, to kind of westernize Russia, bring it back in line with something from the West. Peter the Great was looking at the Ukraine. The Ukrainians were more Greek Orthodox oriented, and the church had to make some reforms. One of the things about the Russian church, if I understand the sketchy bit of history I have, and I'm open for corrections, is that some of their documents were found to be variant from the Greek text, which were considered more authentic. And the Russian people at that time, the great mass of the people, were trying to protect themselves, or had been trying to protect themselves for about 200 years from the Polish Catholics and the Muslim Tartans, and they were trying to resist, and they thought that they were the pure church. And this is the overall great mass of the people. So when some of these reforms then were suggested, that their text had to be corrected in light of some older Greek texts, these people, the ancestors of the old believers, refused this. They felt fairly self-sufficient, and they felt especially proud of their spiritualism. They felt that their spiritualism maybe was a little bit pure, and they rejected. Now, since that time, the ancestors to the people that are in the village now have undergone quite a bit of persecution in Russia and frankly everywhere they've gone. They moved to some of them thought that was the Antichrist coming and committed suicide. Some were thrown in prison, and many of them moved to the frontiers, and they existed apart from the regular Orthodox Church at the time, many times paying double taxes. And but they really stuck to, or tried to stick to, this tradition. Now, the reason I went back to foreign history is I'm trying to, my answer, I think, is that they have resisted for 300 years very much change at all. And they've not only resisted this, but they've gone to the frontiers of Siberia. When the communists took over in the 1900s, 1930s, about 32, they moved into China. They existed in China for a while. Now, this particular group, however, a little surprise was thrown at me the other day. A young lady came in and she said that she wanted to apply for a job as a teacher's aide, and she was from New Jersey. And her husband was one of the young men in the village. He'd reached the marriaging age of between 16 and 18 for boys. Girls, they may get past 15. They're really an old maid. When she said she was from New Jersey, that kind of startled me, and I asked where her people came from, and she said, well, they had gone into exile in Turkey. And so some of their believers didn't go through Siberia as this group did, but some of them went to other parts. But this group came then to Hong Kong, and then to Brazil, and then to Oregon, and then about 1967 found their way to the Kenai Peninsula. And I find that They very much want to comply with the laws. They pay taxes. A lot of people, sound off from everything on the radio say that they do not, but they do pay personal property and real estate taxes. They send their children to school. However, they are still, I think, resisting conforming to what they feel is not a strictly spiritual life that their ancestors have died for and went into exile for. And I really suspect that they will fit in as much as they can to comply with the laws, but they will try to remain separate in their beliefs, in their dress, in their habits. And one of the ways that they do this, as I suggested, is they marry their girls off. And a father told me one day, he said, my young son, he said, he's getting too wild, so it's time for him to get married and settle down. And this is where they avoid the problems of adolescence very much. I'll quit now. If there's any questions.
There are a couple of things one could add to this, and one is that there are other examples of very homogeneous groups. For instance, the Amish are a good example who have been able to maintain a group existence separate from American life, from general American life. I think one problem that Alaska Natives and various other immigrant groups in Alaska have faced, and in the United States as well, is the overwhelming pressures to conform. Pressures for conformity in American life. Historically, this has been true. The whole school system, it seems to me at least, was designed to make Americans out of a ragtag group of foreigners who at various points landed upon these shores. So the pressures that the public school system has exerted, and I think all of you are familiar with the generational clash between the parents who were immigrants and the children who were born in the United States, attended American schools, and became Americans in speech and dress, and looked down upon the old folks and their quaint customs. And I think that a great deal of variety and diversity has been lost to American life because of this process. I think, on the other hand, what we're experiencing now, and the outcome really is so wild, or the possibilities are so wild and undreamed of and unheard of, is this tremendous diversity where we have Mexican Americans demanding rights and privileges, and we have red Americans in Alaska itself. Of course, we have for a number of years now the creation of various materials for the primary schools, readers in Athabascan or Yupik or Inupiat Eskimo. And where this all will lead to eventually, we don't know. Canadians for many years have always prided themselves on the fact that their culture and society is one of the mosaic. And we have always prided ourselves on the melting pot effect that American culture has had upon its citizens. Where this all will lead to, this very, the diversity that is developing now, I don't know. Probably nobody knows, but I think it's very interesting to watch the developments. And certainly Alaska will have a tremendous, or always has had a tremendously rich cultural background because of the different groups who have lived here traditionally, and the many people who have moved into the area later on. As I think one extremely good source for all of those of you who are interested in historical research on the Kenai Peninsula can be found in the brief which was written for the Lower Cook Inlet case. This was touched upon yesterday. Some of you may be aware of it, probably all heard that the federal government took Alaska into court over possessory rights to Lower Cook Inlet. International law is extremely vague on this whole proposition. What constitutes a historic bay? Do you follow the sinuosities of the coast, or do you draw the boundary from headland to headland? Unfortunately, as so often in law, I suppose, arguments can be found on both sides. It has been done both ways. And Alaska decided to fight the case in court. Millions of dollars, of course, are at stake in the oil resources in Lower Cook Inlet. And in the process, they hired a battery of attorneys and historians and various other researchers. And if I'm not mistaken, I've taken a look once at the brief. It's some 1,600 pages long, legal-sized paper, and the footnotes alone are a gold mine. So I suggest that you write to the Alaska judicial system and try to have them send you a copy, Xerox copy, and place in one of the public libraries here, because the information that you find in there will lead you into all kinds of very exciting research possibilities. And it's there already. You know, the only thing is you have to mine it now and go on a strike out from there. But this is, I think, a very important document that should be distributed wide, or at least people should be aware that this work has been done. As it stands right now, the federal government lost in Anchorage when James Vanderhyde ruled against the Department of the Interior. They appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court in San Francisco, and the federal government lost again. They didn't give up, however. They went to the Supreme Court, and at this point, all indications are that the Supreme Court will not hear the case, which means that Alaska will have won, and that a truly historic decision has been made in favor of Alaska.
Are there other questions? We have people coming in at 3 or thereabouts to sit for a while, like, for instance, I was just thinking here, you know, my plans were so nice, and you wouldn't think it to look in that book, because I tossed everything out and started all over and decided I couldn't compete. So I decided I would just humanize and use my own words for the most part, and surely then I wouldn't have to toss that away. Besides, I was way past the deadline. But government, I noticed. I was intending government, religion, education, since statehood, you understand, military, economy, transportation, communication, agriculture. You know, they grew oats and tyonik and fussed around about grandfather's rights up here about the airport where they had gardening rights, and so on and so forth. Oh, yes, of course, we do.
Larry Rickard, or Pickard, and Lynn Doak, you're to call your office, Building 100, immediately.
Oh, you just got here.
Sorry.
We almost promised them immunity, didn't we? Maybe you can get right back. Mrs. Doak is still here. But, and mining and fishing and timely topics which took everything else. Of course, I should have known better with 30 pages allowed that I could get it all in this. But one thing that I wanted to bring out, and that was under government, since we will have government people here pretty soon. We'll have the borough mayor, I hope. Isn't this true, Donis? Will he be able to come for a while? And we will have the judge, the district judge. And there was a time when we just didn't realize that the significance of their jobs was going to reach where it has today. But one of the things in doing the research for this, to do a nice job in that book on government, I found some excellent material that's been done to bring before us the traditional Athabascan law in relation to the current Bush justice. And that's a little book that's just a gold mine of information. And I throw this to you because some of you are probably familiar with the various parts of this. And lots of times when we get out into the village, we think, well, why in the world should this be, et cetera, et cetera. But their interpretation often, the Athabascan interpretation has been historically considerably different about the difference between right and wrong and what is, and what they think of the law enforcement officers that the new century has brought to the village. And it gives such an excellent picture and a realistic picture that certainly it's worth, if you could get hold of a copy of that, it gives one an entirely different view of why it has taken our villages, in many cases, a long time to make the progress that they are now making. And when you understand the path to the present, I think one appreciates so much more the efforts that are being made to understand and to become, I noticed here we said within legal rights, within legal avenues of activity and endeavor. And I throw that to you since we will have some law people after the break at 3 or whenever, and you may want to be thinking of some of these questions too to ask them. I'll turn it from the Oates and Tyonek and this. Let me give it back to you. Very well, John.
Could I ask a question of Dr. Sherwood? He mentioned interest in things, and I caught the fishing fever several years ago and got involved in the commercial fishing industry. And what resource material do we have on the fisheries industry in the Cook Inlet, Kenai Peninsula?
Well, there's one book you should start with. It isn't about the Cook Inlet area specifically. It's Richard Cooley's The Politics of Conservation, The Decline of the Alaska Salmon. And he does go into gear regulation for conservation purposes and makes some very interesting points about the use of technological obsolescence in making conservation policy. You have a number of printed primary sources that are readily available. For example, the bulletins of the Fish Commission. And some of them are very revealing in their description of gear, a number of boats, types of boats, as well as their description of the size of the catch and so on. Also the description of the machinery in the cannery, the technology of canning. There's a particularly neat one, I think. Unfortunately, I don't recall the date. It's 1898 or 99. It's the Bulletin of the Fish Commission, which was published after the cruise of the Fish Commission steamer Albatross. The Albatross just did not come to Alaska only; it went everywhere. And its report, the report of its visit to Cook Inlet, is really quite fascinating. And of course, then you go to the same agencies that you go to government agencies that regulated fishing in Cook Inlet, to the old Fish and Wildlife, and the Department of the Interior, and to other Department of the Interior records as well. Always, when you use agency records, always check out the records of the Secretary as well as the records of the specific agency in which you are interested. Yeah, and these records are also loaded with neat little items. For example, I was fooling around, as Klaus was, in the National Archives a couple of years ago, and lifted a folder on Halibut Cove because nobody ever explained to me satisfactorily why the herring industry collapsed in the 1920s there. The major explanation was that the herring were fished out. But there was an additional explanation that the market for herring, salted herring, disappeared. I think the market was largely eastern. I think this was kosher herring, and the market was largely northeastern. For some reason or another, it disappeared. And it would be interesting to find out what exactly happened. Yeah, these are great records. Now, the inventories are good and bad for some agencies. I don't remember what inventory, whether the Fish and Wildlife Service has a decent inventory available, whether the National Archives has a decent inventory of the Fish and Wildlife records or not. I can't recall, but they might. You would only write to these people and ask. But near at hand are the formal reports of the Department of the Interior in this area. There are a few picture books that Superior Publishing Company has put out, but they don't hang together too well in terms of explaining exactly the evolution of the use of certain kinds of fishing gear. But start with Cooley, use footnotes, and then with the annual reports of the Fish Commission. One of the fascinating things about the Alaskan fishery is that the scientists knew more about fish off the Alaskan shore than they knew about fish off the California shore. Some of the earliest research into the fisheries was done in Alaska, not necessarily Cook Inlet, but in Alaska. And stateside investigations came much later, particularly on the West Coast. People were doing oceanography before they before this time, but they weren't necessarily studying the fish systematically.
There are all kinds of sources that come to my mind. I forget now the exact title of the organization which was responsible for the control of Alaskan fishing, but it started very early in the 1890s, and it was a period of experimentation. Very few agents, there were a couple of agents usually, had to rely on company boats to take them out to the fish traps and various other areas. But from 1890, from the 1890s onward until very recent times, until statehood, there have been innumerable congressional hearings on Alaskan problems, on Alaskan fishery problems particularly. And these can be found, they're bound in the congressional hearings. There must be thousands and thousands of pages which look at the problem from every angle, humanly imaginable. I also noticed that very recently the Alaska Northwest Publishing Company has put out a volume, I haven't read it, I've read a review of it, on Pacific fishing with a very heavy emphasis on the Alaskan fishery. I don't know how good it is or how extensive it is, but this would be a secondary work which certainly should have a great many footnotes which can direct you to various other works in the field. I just can't remember, I think it was 1948 and 49, that there are 4 or 5 volumes of hearings on Alaskan problems, and fishing rated very high as one of the Alaskan problems. So the federal government has been concerned with fishing for a long, long time, and the hearings are very enlightening. Everyone else gets to have his say. I think I ought to make another comment, and I have been interested in homesteading, and I know this is dear to most of your hearts, and perhaps I'm not going to make many friends with the remarks I want to deliver myself off. My feeling has been that homesteading, particularly perhaps in the interior, has not been very successful, and the people who have homesteaded in the interior primarily have turned out to be land speculators. Homesteading here in the Kenai Peninsula, if I understand it correctly, didn't start really until the Second World War, in the post-World War II years. And if I remember correctly again, I think that the failure rate was very high. Many ramifications to the settlement patterns on the Kenai Peninsula. And I remember that at one point the borough and the state government faced the problem of how to get a hold of people who had homesteaded, had gotten patent to their land, and then that some was stateside, and there was no way to collect taxes on these lands. And the state finally decided that after a certain period of time, these lands would revert back to state, or would revert to state ownership. Now, I have had occasion to work with the Bureau of Land Management, and I've been amazed and at the daily requests, and this has gone on for years and years, that flood every BLM office in Alaska. And a typical letter will contain the following items in different arrangement, but they're always the same. The prospective homesteader is asking the BLM for a map which will point out land which is remote from any settlement. A piece of land which will have a stream running through it, which will have enough moose, sheep, goats, caribou, and salmon and whitefish to sustain life, enough trees to be able to build a log cabin and also cut the necessary firewood, but yet close enough to the amenities of town life, for instance, paved roads, rural mail delivery, and school bus pickups. I've collected folders and folders of these things, and I'm not quite certain at this point what I'm going to do with all these letters, but I've recognized they're all the same tenor, and I'm sure that if I ever have an occasion to see if I can find some of the older letters, that the pattern persists. The American dream about your own piece of land in the wilderness which will sustain you, and you can act out the Daniel Boone dream somehow. with the 6 guns on your hips and out there in the wilderness, but yet close enough you can run to the drugstore and purchase the necessities of life. Homesteading has been very much of a problem, and I noticed that there's a student, a doctoral student, who is working on a dissertation which will focus on the Kenai homesteading experience. I'm looking very much forward to this particular piece of work. Morgan?
Yeah, who's doing that?
Some of you might know Melody Grauman, who her husband practiced medicine in Soldotna, and they just moved to Fairbanks a few months ago. And she's doing a doctorate at the University of New Mexico, and her work will focus on the Kenai Peninsula. If you are interested in certainly there's a great deal of material available on the homesteading experience. There's Jorgensen's Alaska's Land Resources, which is an early inventory of the types of lands which were suitable for that particular enterprise. And I think throughout the secondary literature you will find always the comparison, invidious or not, that was always made with the Scandinavian countries. I think all of you have run across this. Alaska has 580,000 square miles and only 80,000 people at one point, or however many there were. And how come, if we're on the same latitude and longitude and we have much better climate and larger resources and so on, how come we're not sustaining a population of 7 or 8 million people like the Scandinavian countries do? And I think there is in the book, I don't know, perhaps you echo my sentiment, that does not raise this question. Why has Alaska not sustained a larger population? Because we are so much like the Scandinavian countries. A comparison that was made as early as 1890s was the establishment of the first agricultural experiment stations in the territory. By Scandinavian. Jorgensen, yes.
I don't have anything to add. Does anyone have any more questions they'd like to ask us? I would like to find the answer to 1 or 2 questions that Klaus raised, for example. What are the trends in homesteading in Kenai? Do people tend to remain on their homesteads? Do they farm? I was a little surprised when I flew down last night. It was one of the few clear days no, that wasn't last night. Day before, it was one of the few clear days I've flown in the area, and there were very few cleared areas. And it seemed to me, my impression was that, although I could not tell even whether the cleared areas were farmed, that there was very little land in cultivation. I'd be very interested to know just how much is in cultivation, how permanent the homesteaders are, what kinds of things they do to support themselves and so on.
I'm glad you brought that question up, because we have some people, in fact, the judge came in just a few minutes ago, and I hope that he will be taking a chair down here, and I think that the borough mayor will be here. And aren't you both homesteaders? Yes, Betty Warren back here is a homesteader, and Mim Toriainen. I told her, I wanted her to be on hand. And here we have one of the finest programs that was ever brought into my schoolroom for my students a few years ago was brought in by Carolyn Humdorf. Carolyn's here. And I look around here and I see more homesteaders. And I think that we could have quite a rousing discussion among our panelists that will be joining us and among people here in the audience. Some of you probably are homesteaders and I don't know it. But I like to think I just know all about all of you. Anybody here on the Kenai, I'd like to know. But at the same time, I think that we can get quite a good discussion of that pretty soon. And yes, and Peggy, I'm wondering if it would be, since Judge Nicholas is here and I don't know how long he can stay, I'm wondering if we should have a very brief break and then perhaps pick up from there along with some of the people. I wish you would come down here and we can get some more chairs down here.
Brief this time.
And let's, if we could get some more chairs down here for some of you people. I'm sure enough of you these days. And you may want to reach down there and get that other one. You don't have to share a mic because I'm sure there will not be more than... And I'll pass this to anybody that needs it down on this end of the area. Yeah, Bob Seymour. You gentlemen going to come up here and stand in the firing line, along with the rest of us?
There you go. Firing line.
Yes, our ammunition's marshmallows.
Good.
Pretty busy, Jess.
Have you met these gentlemen?
No.
This is our borough mayor, right next to you, Stan Thompson.
Stan? Klaus.
This is Klaus Nashke, Dr. Nashke. This is Jess Nicholas. Their experience in law and a lot of other things, homesteading, all kinds of things. And have you met Dr. Sherwood? Stan, the borough mayor, and Jess Nicholas, the judge, and they're homesteaders.
When did you homestead? Oh my gosh, when was it? 19.
Mrs. Peterson, did you ever homestead on the Kenai?
That was post-World War.
But Enid did. I know. Enid has homesteaded, and she's raised foxes, all kinds of, if you like to say fox instead, okay.
Nobody thought it was worth all even bought it before
And Betty, you should be able to give us a lot of information.
Phil Ames is homesteader.
Phil Ames, did you homestead out there too? I thought you were just a marshal. Come on up and join us, Phil. I think he did too. He brought up a lot of pertinent questions. Come on up and join us. Sit up here with the people, and
You might as well.
then you will remind people of the things they want to ask you. We have so many people back here who have so much information. Mary, would you like to come up and join us? Mary Misson? We'd like very much to have you up here, if you will come, please. Vera? Vera? You said yesterday that if we didn't ask you to talk, that you would be ready to have some good things to say today. Would you like to come up and join us? I don't want to take a hunk of our audience here, but we'll get you up here and people will think of all kinds of things that they want to ask you.
I think back to all the controversies.
Oh, yes. We'll keep a mic over here and we'll pass it to Bill. So, I know you did it. I know you did it. I said you're right, yes. Yeah. John, aren't you lonesome back there? See, then you'll be... Enid? You too. I'll tell you, we have a fisherman back here. We have fishermen, we have fox farmers, we have teachers, we have homesteaders, we have all kinds of good people. Hey, Mim. Mim is a new homesteader. Mim is, you know, we had homesteaders, and then we had homesteaders from way back, and then we had homesteaders after the World War II, you know, that you talked about. Then in 1959, Stan can tell you all about that, because I was in his office when a bunch of people from that area came. You didn't. You waited till May, the last of May to come. But these were the new homesteaders, and they came from the east.
And I think that for our talk about homesteading men, that you should be here. You had run-ins with the oil company. Hey, now, where are our representatives of the oil company? This is nice. Mim, don't you want to come up and join us?
All right, well, perhaps there will be others coming in out of the hall, but we have one person here. Guess who? Has to leave pretty quickly. Do you mind my saying why? There's going to be a wedding, and he's the officiating officer. An officer, I wonder if that's right. So you take a look at these people and fire away your questions. Now, our legal questions, as well as homesteading, we better make use of Judge Nicholas and Mayor Thompson while they're here. I don't know whether Mayor Thompson, is he legally equipped for performing marriage ceremonies? Okay.
That's a real good question, isn't it?
Well, I haven't heard it before, and I got to get in something here that somebody else hasn't said.
I haven't heard it answered yet.
He smiled, and his wife would have giggled if she were the giggling kind. We should have Donna's up here. She's the unpaid reporter for the borough mayor's office. And if you want entertainment in the weekly papers in this peninsula, you make a habit of reading Borough Briefs by this unpaid reporter. Honestly, you've never read anything like it before, and it's fun.
I think you all know these people. There's Dr. Morgan Sherwood down there, who brought up questions, and he's sitting right there for any questions you want to ask him. Here we have Mr. Hackala, who is a pretty special sort of person. He was here and is here, and I want, fish and wildlife, moose range, and all kinds of good things. And next to him is Bob Seymour in similar business. And you should have lots of things to ask these men. And here we have Claus, and here we have the borough mayor, Stan Thompson, and we have Jess Nicholas, the judge. We have are you still a marshal? He has been the United States Marshal in the most interesting places. I'm not going to tell you, I'm going to let him tell you. And here we have John. Took a little doing, but we got John. And of course, Mary. She can answer all kinds of good questions. Yes, she knows everything. I wish I knew as much, all of the things she knows. And here we have Vera Chapo. And she's just listening, but make sure that she has to answer a question or two. All right? Would you gentlemen like to take the mic or sit in front of the mic and come up with something, or do you want to wait for a question?
headquarters in Anchorage. Now, records pertaining to the Kenai Peninsula would be found in the offices of the Bureau of Land Management in Anchorage. You might have every so many years, and I'm not quite sure what time frame federal agencies use, but every few years, materials that are generated by these offices are turned over to lock and records and don't give you access to them, they will do so. So many times you have to insist on, or perhaps phony a little bit, say, I was told by somebody important, to come here and check these things out, and then you might get some action. But it pays to be firm and insist on your rights as an American citizen that you want to look at these records because they are part of the public domain.
Thank you.
Stan and Jess, I don't know, I'm thinking of that wedding. I don't know how you want to divide this. I'm interested in the aspect of early Kenai, that is in the law in Kenai at the time of statehood, before and since, and how it all came about, how it was then, how it all came about, and the progress that's been made, which is fantastic. And I wish these two gentlemen now, before the phone rings and they have to leave, would tell us something about the law here on the Kenai during this period of the coming of statehood and the changes.
Okay, Mary, can you hear me? I'll start off
by telling of the time before statehood. Of course, this is a little bit like being asked to come and speak for 3 minutes and tell all you know, but maybe that is all I know. Some of the old times, well, kind of like an old timer, was being interviewed by a reporter, and he was asked, he was 90 years old, the reporter said, "You've lived here all your life?" And he said, "Yes." And the reporter said, "Well, you've seen many changes?" And he said, "Yes, and I've been against every one of them." So maybe the good old times had some good things too, I don't know. Clemtillion describes the good old times as having to walk 30 miles with a bad toothache and then having Doc Pollard pull the wrong tooth. The best part, perhaps, of the old days were that you could do things, do what you wanted to more without stepping on someone else's toes or having them step on you. There was no zoning, no building codes, no regulatory agencies like the PUC or the ICC, etc. If you wanted to start a truck line, you bought a truck. If you wanted to build a house, you built a house. You didn't go for building permits. You didn't worry about your foundation. If you just wanted a shack, you built a shack. You had your choice to do with what you wanted to on your own land. Hopefully, you did build it on your own land, although that didn't always turn out either. Of course, there was no TV or radio. Or there was no TV, there was radio from Anchorage if one wanted to listen. We didn't have any telephones first. Got along quite well. I remember the first year we got one, it cost me $65 the first month. I didn't know how I got along without it before, but we really didn't miss it. When I first arrived in Kenai, in '53, I moved here permanently. People, they worked at the cannery in the winter that were here, or they fished, in the summer rather, or they fished for 3 months or less, and then they might do a little hunting in the fall, get in a little wood, and that was it for the year. Their work was through. The rest of the year was spent in playing cards, visiting, and doing whatever it is people like to do in situations like that. Civilization has come a long way and improved that very much. We can now work all winter. The commissioner was, in those days, the law of the area. There wasn't much transportation, and he was often in the company of a United States deputy marshal. He handled all criminal cases except serious felony cases, and they were bound over. He handled all civil cases up to $1,000, and as that was more money than most of us had in those days, that means he covered most civil cases. He was probate judge, handled all estates, was juvenile judge, was recorder, coroner, justice of the peace, performed marriages, filed death certificates, etc., etc. In other words, it was just about it. Oftentimes, he often acted semi-officially, too, when there wasn't any marshal or policeman in the area. Well, as an example, one time somebody banged at my door at 3 o'clock in the morning. A little girl was standing there with tears in her eyes. "Come quick, Daddy's killing Mommy." So I pulled on some trousers, ran over to where it was, and the father had left by then. The lady was pretty well soused, and well, she wasn't hurt, seriously anyway. And so the little girl was put to bed and things were straightened up and went home. But that's just an example of some of the unofficial duties that the commissioner often found himself involved in. Another example was one night Jerry Hobart was running P&A in the old office, and they lived in the back apartment of it. They heard a noise in the night, got a shotgun, and he found a couple of men out trying to rob P&A office. So he marched him over and had his wife drive the car, and he marched him over in the headlights to my office. I think it was 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, I don't know, some ungodly hour. And what to do with him? There wasn't any jail, there wasn't any marshal. Well, the only thing I could think of to do was put him down in my well, which wasn't as bad as it sounded. The pump was down there. It was dry up to that level, about 15 feet down. They didn't want to climb down. The fellow said he was scared of heights. But anyway, they climbed down the ladder to the well, and I put a board or two over the top and had my big husky dog sit on top for the rest of the night, and we went to bed. The next morning, we were able to call the police office in Anchorage and get it taken care of. Of course, the FBI came out when the trial came on to see what sort of inhuman treatment we had given these poor prisoners. But the commissioner was not truly a full-time job in most areas. When I first took over, it paid, maybe $3,000. All of it, or almost all of it, came from recordings. You got paid so much of recording. In my case, I also ran a store, and it wasn't a bit unusual to find someone in the commissioner's office and then walk out in the store and sell them something. Most commissioners were neither lawyers nor trained. In fact, nearly all were semi or politically appointed. Locally, when I took over, there had been a Democrat administration previously. The Republican administration took over. The local Republican club met and decided who they would recommend locally for the job of commissioner, and then the judge, if he agreed, appointed that individual. Of course, this power, which there was a lot of power in the hands of underpaid and untrained people picked from all walks of life, often led to excesses. 3 commissioners before me were indicted on various felony charges. One spent 5 years in jail. I don't think that one paid. But, well, back further, one commissioner in Kenai in prohibition days, for instance, had the liquor business all tied up. It was kind of rough on anybody brought before him on a charge of bootlegging. But the judge dispensed his own liquor in a bucket he kept right beneath his feet under the desk there. In general, however, justice in the old days was more inclined to be exactly that, or attempt to be exactly that, justice rather than law. You could do that easier when there was fewer people, when you knew more of the circumstances, and hopefully it carried out. Well, for instance, one time an elderly man was fishing a fish site on Salamatoff Beach. There was a storm came up. It was at a high tide period, The storm came up under his cabin, it caught his boat, it wrecked his whole place. He would manage to push his wife up the bank, and in the process of that middle of the night storm, he broke his arm, and the next day he wasn't able to get his fish nets out of the water after the time had elapsed that you were allowed or required to do so. So he tried to get a boat. He even walked clear into Kenai with a broken arm to try to get a dory to use, but everybody, of course, after the storm was using their dories, and it was a day or so, or half a day or so later before he was able to get them out. In the meantime, the Fish and Wildlife plane had flown over, seen his nets out, and had radioed into the local agent to file charges, which he did. He didn't want to, but he did. They flew down in their plane with for the trial with a whole pack of people, Fish and Wildlife agents, to get justice on this man. Well, I found him not guilty for whatever reason was, I guess an act of God. He tried every way he could to get the nets out, but nevertheless, legally, the nets were out. Now, I don't know now whether the law would be able to do that. They probably would, but we've gone past the stage, perhaps, although still, I don't mean to be putting Judge Nicholas down here. It's a lot easier to handle when there are less people in a different way than you have to when there are more people. There's also the fact that in those days sometimes that was abused. The lady in Kodiak, who was commissioner, I remember quite well telling us at a commissioner's conference she had juvenile problems, so she called in all the boys and their parents, and she turned them over a knee one by one and spanked them. Well, you can't do that. And I remember the lady, or the man in Nome, who was commissioner. At the same conference, the judge was explaining to all of us commissioners what rights the defendants had and how you had to tell them their rights and so forth. And when he got done, she turned to me and she says, "I hope the people in Nome never find out about that." So we've gone a long way from that. But there were a lot of things of interest. Sometimes, of course, we were accused of things that didn't occur. One time the marshal here was named Thompson. The only attorney was named Thompson, and I was Thompson. People thought we had the town all sewed up. Of course, we weren't necessarily all related, but they didn't know that. There are many cases, humorous cases that occurred at that time, but we've got quite a few people on the agenda today, so I won't go into too many of those. I do remember one time when I was out of town for some reason. My wife, Donis, had to be deputy commissioner, perform a wedding ceremony, and I believe the lady listing her previous marriages, I believe it was 15 before she couldn't remember any further back. Needless to say, my wife didn't do a good job on that marriage. It only lasted a short while. But the good old times had a lot of other problems too outside of commissioners, lack of fresh meats and fresh vegetables, and lack of protection quite often, particularly in the more rural areas. But they were interesting, and the law at that time was an attempt, and often and usually worked quite well. Sometimes the justice or the commissioner began to think that he owned the job. I remember one case when they changed at the same time that I became commissioner. They changed administrations. The commissioner in one town in this borough got mad, and he thought he should keep the job. A new one was appointed, but he got mad and he threw all the books, all the records out in the street. He wasn't going to have anything to do with it if somebody else was appointed. So most of them in the takeover like that were very helpful, and it was a good thing because when new commissioners came in, they didn't know anything. They didn't have any training. There was one little black book that told how to perform marriage ceremonies and a few other things. And unless a previous commissioner would come in and advise you and help you, it was rather hard to carry forth as you should. But Jess, I'm going to let you take over on this now and tell how much it's improved since statehood.
Stan, you stole my opening story because it so happened on February 20th, 1960 was the date that I took over. It was the date that I came in and found the man in the well.
That's right.
You recall that? I received a message, and I won't say a phone call because I lived out on the homestead and it was 20 miles to the nearest phone. someone came down and got me and said, well, you're now the magistrate. We knew it was going to happen, but we weren't sure when it was going to happen. But anyway, that was my first experience in the judiciary, was finding a defendant in the well. I was very happy to send him off to Anchorage because I didn't know what else to do with him at that time. Anyway, my first time I even became interested in the judiciary was about November or early December of 1959. A man, and I'm sure that most of you here, or a lot of you here knew him, Gene Smith, who lived down at Coho at that time. He's since deceased. Came by the house one day and he said, Nick, Stan Thompson is not going to apply for the magistrate's job when the state takes over the court system. Says, we would like for you to apply. And I says, Gene, I don't know anything about that. Oh, he says, that doesn't matter. He says, anybody can be a magistrate. So I thought about it a little while, and I finally submitted an application to it. And although it's supposed to be a non-political job, as I recall back in 1959 in about December, there was an awful lot of political caucuses of the Democratic Party held around, and I went to some of those and was endorsed by just about all the Democratic caucuses. And it so happened that there were 3 Democrats applying for the job, and at that time I thought that I was just as good as qualified as any of the rest of them were. However, after almost 15 years, I've come to the conclusion I was just the lesser of 3 evils. I did go to Anchorage in early January and was chosen by then the presiding Superior Court Judge of the 3rd District. It was Judge Davis. I was told, we don't know when you're going to go to work, and you don't get paid until you go to work, and sometime the federal government's going to turn the court system over to us. At that time, you will become employed. It so happens on February the 20th, 1960, that Alaska took over its own court system. Recently, Judge Hanson gave a speech at the Kenai Chamber of Commerce and was explaining some of the changes that have transpired in the last 3 years since he's been here. And he said he was the first Superior Court judge down here. Of course, he says, Jeffs has been here always, forever, he said, or something like this. Well, this isn't true. Stan was here ahead of me. And Stan was very cooperative when I took over from him, too. I want to say that. He let me come to his office before I took over and learn how to do some of the work. In fact, as I recall, I came in and did some recording several days before I took over. But anyway, there have been many changes. When I first took over, we were in a 16 by 16 foot office in the front of Siemens Furniture Store. I can remember about the first year I was in there was a state police car out in front of the furniture store, and it had a black box set up on it. And I believe the officer was Wayne Morgan, and he would get the speeders as they came through town and catch up with them before they got to the FAA, and says, you can come right back by where you were speeding and pay your fine. It was all in a matter of 10 minutes, and everything could be conducted all at once. This didn't look very good, so we finally asked him at least to move from in front of the courthouse with his black box. Our problems have been both urban problems and bush problems here. If you're talking to someone from Anchorage or Fairbanks or some more urban areas, anything south of Spanor is a bush area. And they still think of Kenai basically as being a bush area and not needing any services. And this is not true. In fact, it was just a week ago today that we had the trial court administrator and the presiding Superior Court judge in this district down here trying to convince them that we needed more judicial services, and particularly we needed to keep Judge Hanson here more often. I think probably one incident that relates in my mind was prior to about 1960, the state police at that time all had station wagons, and then in about 1960 they came out and started issuing them sedans. Now prior to this time they used the station wagons for ambulances and whatever they had to use them for. I remember in the summer of 1960 Wayne Morgan called me one Saturday morning and says, we've got a body up on the beach that we have to go get. And this was my first coroner's call, and I says, fine, we'll go up and get it. And so we went up on the beach, and it so happened that the body was about a mile or a mile and a half down the beach. So we walked down the beach and took a body bag with us, and we put the body in the body bag, and there were 3 of us, and we had to carry it a mile and a half back up the beach, and we got to his car. The body had been dead for some time, and the man was stiff, and we couldn't put the body in the trunk, and we couldn't put it in the back seat. So we finally ended up by borrowing some running lines off of a set net site that was up there and strapping it across the back trunk of the car to bring it into town. This looked rather odd, driving into town with sort of like having one cross the back of your horse, I suppose, in old days. No next of kin, we couldn't find him next of kin, so we finally got someone to preach a sermon and someone to bury the body after a reasonable length of time, such as a couple of 3 hours or something like that. Really, and incidentally, I think that was that was the first coroner's call I had. Over the next 2 years, I had many calls, such as having to go out and help pick up a body in the Kenai River that had been there for about 2 or 3 weeks, going to suicides and not describing it. Anyway, I finally decided, well, there's something wrong here. It's ridiculous because there's nothing that I can do except go and look. I'm not an investigative officer. Finally, I determined that what I should do is start delegating a little authority, and I think that since 1962 that I have delegated all of my authority on coroner's cases. I've always found it's much simpler to let someone else do those little chores than to have to do them. We have come a long way in the judicial system since 1960. As I say, it'll be 15 years in February. We now have a full-time Superior Court judge present. We are in the process of having a new courthouse built, which we should be into by next July. I'm sure that there have been miscarriages of justice in the last 15 years, and I'm sure there'll be miscarriages of justice in the next 1,000 years. But as I recall what Judge Burke in Anchorage made a statement here a while back, he says, I'm not paid for being right all the time. He says, I'm only paid for doing what I think is right. And I think that, that this is the way most of the judges feel. I think that this about concludes what I have. Mary, leave some time for questions.
Thank you. I think the board's going to change the tape, but that leaves some time for questions.